U.S. History students, this is Mr. Worthington, and what I have for you today is a brief timeline presenting 20 events from American history. These are the sixes and the zeros in your list of 100 events that you can see on the website online. So that's events like 6, 16, 26, and events like 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. Now, what I want to do today is use these events to look at the sort of major eras in American history that we talked about at the beginning of this unit, way back on the first Friday of the school year. The first of those eras is the Colonial Era. And that's what we call it in the United States, because this is the era during which the British colonies are established. It's the era during which there are Spanish colonies established throughout North America, including in Mexico and Central America. It's an era of new intermixture of peoples from around the world in the American continent. But to most people living at that time, this would have seemed like sort of small sideshows versus all the dramatic, important things happening in Asia and India and Europe and Latin and South America and all around the world at the time. The British colonies were just not that well settled. So one other way we have to think of the colonial era is not an era of colonization of the Americas, but an era of dramatic new ideas. So two events that sort of represent that trend are the Reformation, which is a moment of religious revolution in Europe when all churches, it starts out as the Catholic Church, and many Protestant churches break away from the Catholic Church during the Reformation in the 1500s. And as you'll see, that has consequences for later American history. Similarly, we have a movement called the Enlightenment, and right here we have a guy named Rene Descartes, and Rene Descartes is saying, "I think, therefore I am." So this is a movement in the 1600s and 1700s, and the basic idea here, logic, knowledge, reason, these are the things that, according to Enlightenment philosophers, will make the human race better off. So right away in the Revolutionary era, we can see the influence of those ideas. Particularly the ideas of the Enlightenment are all over the Declaration of Independence. One of the most famous thinkers of the Enlightenment is a guy named John Locke, who believed in sort of using empirical observation to understand the world better and then to improve the way political systems are designed. That's exactly what the founders are thinking of doing when they write things like the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, John Locke is quoted pretty much verbatim at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. So the American Revolution is founded in the ideas of the Enlightenment. At the same time, it's also founded in the idea of, you should have the best person in charge at any given time. It shouldn't be just about their sort of charismatic authority. And that's an idea that's presented pretty clearly by George Washington in his farewell address in 1796. A lot of you know that George Washington was the sort of father of our country, the first president, leading military figure in the Revolutionary era. Washington gives up power when he feels like he's nearing the age for retirement. And he sets the stage for other presidents to do that again and again throughout American history. One way that the Reformation and the Enlightenment both continue to influence the United States, and as we enter the age of Jackson, so like the early 1800s, would be through the rise of the elementary education system, which is sort of led by a guy named Horace Mann, who does his most famous work in the 1830s. Now, the Reformation, since there are all these different churches competing to try and get support from people, it led to much more extensive education. People need to learn to read so they could read what these churches wanted them to read and decide what their opinion was. And similarly, the Enlightenment, it's all about the spread of knowledge and use of knowledge to make society better. So it obviously supports education too. So these trends from European philosophical thought and religious thought in the way back in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, they sort of lead into what the creation of our educational system in the early 1800s, our elementary education system. So aside from those trends, the Age of Jackson is also where we see sort of the beginning of what becomes the Civil War. So we have the South Carolina nullification crisis in 1832. It's this dispute where South Carolina claims that it has the right to just not obey U.S. government laws if it doesn't like them. And, it might seem unreasonable when you put it like that, but at the time, a lot of people felt like that was true. The U.S. government didn't have the authority to compel obedience from the states. And South Carolina felt both justified in that sort of rebellion and, in addition to feeling justified, wanted to do it in the first place. This is an indication of both the divisions between North and South and the fact that it is possible for those divisions to magnify into civil war. And the Civil War is going to go on from 1861 to 1865, but it actually continues for decades after that. So, to a certain extent, Reconstruction after the Civil War is this era in which the defeated southern states who had rebelled, including obviously South Carolina, which is the leader of those states in a lot of ways, the first state to rebel in 1861, just as it was the only state to rebel in 1832. There's a lot of resistance still to reforms like the abolition of slavery after the end of the Civil War. And in particular, you see violence in which white groups like the Ku Klux Klan use violence to suppress voting amongst freed slaves. And this leads some people to even look at the era of Reconstruction and say things are worse than slavery at that time. Now, Civil War era, though, is also an era of sort of technological advance, government advance. So we see the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a railroad that goes across the continent, across the United States in the mid-1860s. That sort of leads us into this industrial age and progressive era, the late 1800s. Things that happened during that era, we're going to see these charitable, in general, it's an era of economic growth for the United States, but also an era when people are concerned about the direction the United States is taking and are willing to sort of do dramatic and radical things to try and change that direction. So, example of the splendid success of American society is the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And actually at that time, people were even talking about Chicago as a potential capital for the United States because that's how fast that city was growing. Charitable Impulse, sort of exemplified by Jane Addams founding Hull House, which is just this institution that helped out poor and immigrant women in 1889. But there's a darker side to that impulse, which is, Jane Addams wants to get rid of poor and immigrant women by supporting them, by building their culture and their values that they bring from their countries into the American way and sort of integrating them into a larger society that's accepting. So Jane Addams has this really beautiful vision of things, sort of a similar distaste for poverty, though, could lead people to actually just sort of detest and think of the poor as lesser. And so a good example of this is the Indiana Forced Sterilization Law. It was passed in 1907. It says that if people can be found to be defective, so a lot of times this would be associated with being what they would call mentally defective. If people qualify as that, then the government could take away their ability to have children without their permission. And We see towards the end of this era more and more distrust of these large government programs, even though a lot of them, I'd say the vast majority of them, all of them probably were not as bad as the forced sterilization law, and a lot of them were beneficial, like cutting down child labor and that kind of thing. There's suspicion of it, though, especially after this harsh winter during World War One, when government regulation of fuel supplies sort of coincides with there not being enough fuel to keep people's homes warm. So by the end of the industrial age, there's some people are pushing for bigger government programs. Some people are suspicious of them. Then we enter this era of just total crisis. The Great Depression, you see the stock market collapse. A lot of people lose their jobs. A lot of struggle for a lot of families. Around the same time, or not long after, the United States fights World War II. This is a poorly drawn picture of Rosie the Riveter, who's a famous symbol of women's work during that era, and that women going out and getting jobs on the home front helps get the U.S. economy back going again after the Great Depression. It's after World War II that, the sort of conflict over what the U.S. government should be, to some extent it continues. I mean, in some ways, this is the era when the U.S. government emerges more powerful than ever before. The CIA becomes a sort of secret agency that the United States government uses to intervene and play an important role all over the world. But at the same time, people are really scared of the U.S. government. And there's this witch hunt called the Second Red Scare that takes place during the 1950s, where tons of people in the government, including people who aren't communists at all, are arrested and accused of being communists. So there's still conflict over, do we trust our government or to do whatever it wants all over the world, or are we scared of them, worried that they're trying to control us? Now, we see some monumental government programs get started not long after that in the 1960s, Medicare, Medicaid, and this is called the War on Poverty. We see this same impulse way back from what Jane Addams was doing in the 1880s. And so that's sort of triumphant in the 1960s, that impulse to use government to do things to make life better for individual Americans. There's some other things going on at the time as well, and this is California no-fault divorce law. A lot of people look back on and say that it's changed the way families organized in the United States. It changed the sort of decisions people make about marriage. And it starts in California, but eventually most states in the nation have no-fault divorce laws where you can get divorced if husband and wife both agree to it, whether or not one of them did something sort of criminally wrong. By the 1980s, there's a lot of concern about how the United States is changing, justified or unjustified, there is. And one of the concerns is the government has become too powerful. It's doing too much. Medicaid are too much. And this drives this movement to cut taxes and reduce government spending that we see sort of personified in the Ronald Reagan years in office. That's an early the whole 1980s, really. He's in office from 1981 to 1989. His big tax cuts in 1981 and 1986. And that sort of suspicion over what government's doing and its relationship with business continues to this day, as there's a lot of controversy around a 2010 Supreme Court case that allows corporations to spend as much as they want to support political candidates. And boom, that brings us to today. So this has been, I understand, a really rapid-fire video. I've felt myself talking fast. I've talked about 10 events in less than 15 minutes. So feel free, play it slow, play it again, relax. But I wanted to get it in quick here. That way I could get captions for you. So thanks, guys.